Hi everyone, today I'll be talking about Michael Schellenberger's talk, Why Renewables Can't Save the Planet. So here's today's agenda. The speaker breaks his presentation down using a number of stages, which I've used to organize this presentation. We'll start with the context. The talk was held in 2018. During this time, like now, the topic of climate change is increasingly becoming a part of public and political interest. So are renewable energy technologies as a way to reduce our impact. The story comes at a time when the enthusiasm for renewables is growing, while the negative implications of them are less well known. The goal of the talk is to highlight the impacts of these seemingly benign technologies, how nuclear does not share these negative aspects, and why nuclear should play a greater role in our clean energy transition. Groups like academics, citizens, environmentalists, and policymakers care about this story because both renewable energy tech and nuclear are both widely approved and promising steps to reducing climate change. Let's start with stage one.
When I was a boy, my parents would sometimes take me camping in California. We would camp in the beaches, in the forests, in the deserts. Some people think the deserts are empty of life, but my parents taught me to see the wildlife all around us. The hawks, the eagles, the tortoises. One time when we were setting up camp, we found a baby scorpion with its stinger out. And I remember thinking how cool it was that something could be both so cute and also so dangerous. After college, I moved to California and I started working on a number of environmental campaigns. I got involved in helping to save the state's last ancient redwood forest and blocking a proposed radioactive waste repository set for the desert. Shortly after I turned 30, I decided I wanted to dedicate a significant amount of my life to solving climate change. I was worried that global warming would end up destroying many of the natural environments that people had worked so hard to protect.
So at the outset of his talk, Mr. Schellenberger tells a story of his life and how it led him to a career in the environmental sector. He builds empathy with the audience by discussing childhood stories and how his life has been shaped by nature. I think these stories are effective in reaching the audience because they're universal experiences that everyone can empathize with. I think it was a great introduction because it gives us the impression that Michael cares deeply about nature and the environment and that he's achieved things at a high level. It shows us that he is someone that has truly considered the issues in his talk and that he can be trusted. I also thought it helped that he dressed in casual clothing. It made him look more like a regular guy as opposed to a nuclear energy lobbyist. And at the end of this clip, Michael explains how he helped facilitate a $150 billion investment in clean tech and renewables, and how he was excited when these projects were finally launched in his home state of California. However, he started to see some issues.
And other kinds of clean tech. But right away, we started to encounter some problems. So first of all, the electricity from solar rooftops ends up costing about twice as much as the electricity from solar farms. And both solar farms and wind farms require covering a pretty significant amount of land with solar panels and wind turbines, and also building very big transmission lines to bring all that electricity from the countryside into the city. Both of those things were often very strongly resisted by local communities, as well as by conservation biologists who were concerned about the impacts on wild bird species and other animals.
So in stage two, we're introduced to the problems that Michael saw emerge during the building of solar and wind infrastructure. In order to build a comprehensive case, Michael discusses the negative impacts of these projects from various angles, including the economic, environmental, and social issues that arose. It's effective because he's transmitting knowledge applicable to a variety of audiences rather than just environmentalists or economists, for example. In so doing, he's acknowledging the various audience groups and helping them to pay attention and feel involved. I think it was effective that he didn't get too technical, instead focusing on easy to understand concepts, and by now the audience is starting to see some flaws with solar and wind projects that they may not have heard of before. Later in the clip, Michael admits trying to justify these negative outcomes. One specific example is that he rationalizes the thousands of birds killed by wind turbines by comparing that with the millions killed by cats every year. It's effective because he's describing his emotional process, which is highly relatable, and draws a connection between how he and the audience may be rationalizing things in the same way. In stage 3, Michael begins to describe how the issues he was seeing persisted and how they began to change his mind. In particular, earlier in this clip, he discusses how some of the ideas to improve solar and wind projects were unprofitable or unfeasible, ultimately creating greater economic burden than gain. However, I believe the real impacts of this stage are expressed about now.
Blowouts of the grid. And it turns out that when it comes to birds and cats, cats don't kill eagles. Eagles kill cats. What cats kill are the small, common sparrows and jays and robins, birds that are not endangered and not at risk of going extinct. What do kill eagles and other big birds like this kite, as well as owls and condors and other threatened and endangered species, are wind turbines. In fact, they're one of the most significant threats to those big bird species that we have. We just haven't been introducing the airspace with many other objects like we have wind turbines over the last several years. And in terms of solar, building a solar farm is a lot like building any other kind of farm. You have to clear the whole area of wildlife. So this is a picture of 1/3 of one of the biggest solar farms in California called Ivanpah. In order to build this, they had to clear the whole area of desert tortoises, literally pulling desert tortoises and their babies out of burrows, putting them on the back of pickup trucks and transporting them to captivity, where many of them ended up dying. And the current estimates are that about 6,000 birds are killed every year, actually catching on fire above the solar farm and plunging to their deaths.
So here we see Michael use shocking, hard-hitting stories that add context to the statistics. Furthermore, he does well by contextualizing negative realities of solar and wind projects that are harsh truths that many might not have considered because we typically only hear positive things about these technologies. Later in the clip, he offers a good, memorable statement that the major problems with renewables aren't technical, but they're natural. By this point, the audience's perspective has likely shifted. However, I believe this is when Michael's talk starts to go a bit downhill. In stage 4, Michael transitions from the problem to the data story, starting with a description of the problematic economic costs of solar and wind electricity. He refers to 2 case studies, Germany and California, and visualizations showing rising electricity prices over several years as measured by cents per kilowatt hour. He contextualizes the data, noting that the years correspond to when each state was going through its big renewable push. Though these charts are clear and easy to understand, it's important to note that Germany's drastic price increases are due at least in part to their decision in 2011 to close all nuclear power plants by 2022 in response to the Fukushima disaster. I'm sure Michael knew this, so I found it a little bit convenient that he'd use the data anyway. Nevertheless, the data does paint a clear picture. Electricity costs are rising as renewable energy goes online. However, some audience members may be thinking that a few extra bucks are a fair price to pay to avoid climate change. It's all right.
Big renewable energy push. Now, you might think, well, dealing with climate change is just going to require that we all pay more for energy. That's what I used to think. But consider the case of France. France actually gets twice as much of its electricity from clean, zero-emission sources than does Germany. And yet, France pays almost half as much for its electricity. How can that be? Well, you might have already anticipated the answer. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear power, about 75% in total. And nuclear just ends up being a lot more reliable, generating power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 90% of the year. We see this phenomenon show up at a global level. So, for example, there's been a natural experiment over the last 40 years, even more than that, in terms of the deployment of nuclear and the deployment of solar. You can see that at a little bit higher cost, we got about half as much electricity from solar and wind than we did from nuclear.
So what I found to be effective here was the way that Michael spoke directly to the thoughts that the audience may have been having and how he ties them together with his own, by saying that's what I used to think. By focusing again on economics including cost, efficiency, and reliability, Michael is addressing the primary pain points of solar and wind, all the while describing nuclear as a clean energy source. The comparison between 2 somewhat similar European countries in terms of population, wealth, and stability bodes well for his analysis, as it highlights the impact that one country's policies have had against another. It makes you think, if a country like France has done it, why shouldn't we? These simplistic data points are convincing, but at this stage he's focusing on the economics of the issue, and I wonder if they tell the whole story. But before we move on, I wanted to touch on the final graph, or To me, this graph shows that nuclear has simply been around much longer than renewables have, especially solar. As we know, the nuclear path has seen some serious issues along the way, so I wonder if it isn't reasonable to assume that renewables are equally undergoing a period of transition towards greater efficiency and lower costs. With nuclear energy having a 35 to 45-year head start, I don't think this graphic is effective for Michael's point. Throughout the talk, Michael also places a major emphasis on the unreliability of of renewable energy technologies. I think this visualization hurts that point because it shows that there is still so much room for innovation, through batteries, for example. Now for stage 5.
Energy. Now, I think you might be wondering, and it's quite reasonable to ask, is nuclear power safe? And what do you do with the waste? Well, those are very reasonable questions. Turns out that there's been scientific studies on this going over 40 years. This is just the most recent study that was done by the prestigious British medical journal Lancet, finds that nuclear power is the safest. It's easy to understand why. According to the World Health Organization, about 7 million people die annually from air pollution, and nuclear plants don't emit that. As a result, the climate scientist James Hansen looked at it, and he calculated that nuclear power has already saved almost 2 million lives to date. It turns out that even wind energy is more deadly than nuclear. This is a photograph taken of 2 maintenance workers in the Netherlands shortly before one of them fell to his death to avoid the fire, and the other one was engulfed in flames.
So once again, I think Michael does well by anticipating the question in everyone's mind, is nuclear safe and what do we do with the waste? He assures us that these are very reasonable questions to ask, which hints that he, as an expert, has already considered and resolved these issues in his own mind. However, I found his choice of data strange because it immediately sticks out. Nuclear power safe. Safe? Sure, maybe it's reliable relative to renewables, but I'm not sure about safe. And what about the zero accidents claim? Even if this data is justified in some way by the journal that published it, it just doesn't sit right, and it made me begin questioning Michael more. It's also strange to use air pollution as a measure when renewables don't produce this either. Lastly, I found his choice of image to be a bit obnoxious. Research shows that there are only a few deaths associated with renewable accidents, but he's cherry-picked one to make his point, which I didn't really appreciate. And it's ironic because we all likely have images of nuclear disasters in our mind. I think that Michael's choice of image, as well as his failure to even acknowledge that there have been some nuclear mishaps in the past, ultimately cheapen the legitimate concerns people may have about nuclear power. It also makes me wonder about the validity of his data. Since 1945, there's been 7 major accidents of nuclear, 4 of which have led to significant nuclear fallout. Although radioactive materials spread in ways that are difficult to study, it has been shown that cancer rates in regions affected are significantly higher, not only among those impacted, but their children as well. So to say no deaths is a bit ridiculous, and I think it negatively affects the convincingness of his story. This can be a lesson for us to consider moving forward.
Now, what about environmental impact? Well, I think a really easy way to think about it is that uranium fuel, which is what we use to power nuclear plants, is just really energy dense. About the same amount of uranium as this Rubik's Cube can power all of the energy that you need in your entire life. As a consequence, you just don't need that much land in order to produce a significant amount of electricity. Here we can compare the solar farm I just described, Ivanpah, to California's last nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon. It takes 450 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity as it does from nuclear. You would need 17 more solar farms like Ivanpah in order to generate the same output as Diablo Canyon, and of course it would then be unreliable.
So Michael now discusses the environmental impacts of nuclear, offering that by virtue of uranium's incredible power, very little land is required to produce energy. In adding a visual aid through the Rubik's Cube, it provides us a good level of understanding on a highly technical and complex subject. In continually speaking to the unreliability of renewable energy, Michael is instilling in the audience a talking point that they will certainly remember when they leave the talk. However, I again found his choice of imagery to be a bit too perfect. Shortly after reviewing the spatial considerations, Michael introduces this visualization, showing the massive tons of materials required to build each energy producer per terawatt hour. This is great data for Michael as it highlights the extreme efficiency of nuclear from a materials perspective. He notes that solar panels require 17 times more materials than nuclear plants do, which also has an impact in terms of material mining and production emissions, as well as how to handle these materials at end of life. His concern is that these materials will be shipped to developing countries for disassembly, exposing workers there to toxic elements. I believe this is another good point for Michael, as it continues to chip away at the dreamlike image that many of us may have about renewable energy technologies. However, it's fair to point out that there isn't really a plan for nuclear waste either.
The consequence is that what comes out at the end, since its material throughput, is just not a lot of waste from nuclear. All of the waste from the Swiss nuclear program fits into this room. Nuclear waste is actually the only waste from electricity production that's safely contained and internalized. Every other way of making electricity emits the waste into the natural environment, either as pollution or as material waste.
So as we're nearing the end of his talk, Michael finally comes to a crucial question. What do we do with nuclear waste? The visual of an entire country's waste fitting into a single room is a convincing point related to the relatively small land use required by nuclear, but it isn't the whole truth, because nuclear waste can't simply be kept in a room like this forever. Furthermore, there is significant concern around our ability to safely store nuclear waste, and from what I could gather, only one country on Earth has long-term plans on how to safely do this: Finland. From what I've seen, the facility they are building is an enormous undertaking, requiring a very considerable amount of land, which doesn't play well for Michael's argument. So once again, it seems that Michael isn't really being entirely truthful. Nevertheless, he ends his clip with a good thought-provoking question. In an effort to save the climate, are we destroying the environment?
There's just this problem with nuclear. While it's been pretty popular to move from dirtier to cleaner energy sources, from energy diffuse to energy dense sources, nuclear is just really unpopular for a bunch of historical reasons. And
So in this final section, Michael touches on the topic of public opinion, and it seemed like he might concede that nuclear isn't exactly a silver bullet solution. Instead, he states that nuclear is unpopular for a bunch of historical reasons and doesn't discuss the issue any further. In my opinion, this is a mistake. Michael should have taken the time here to address the audience's concerns, perhaps by detailing how safety measures or infrastructure capabilities have improved. In my opinion, anything would have been better than what he said. As it stands, we experience one major nuclear accident every 30 years for 10% of global energy supply. If that number becomes 30%, are we to expect having a major accident every 10 years? These are the types of questions that Michael could have delivered assurances for, but he didn't, which I found to be a little bit disappointing. So overall, I felt it was a good presentation that opened my eyes to many issues with renewables that I, as well as others, may not have heard about before or have conveniently ignored. I felt that Michael started the talk very well by creating empathy with the audience and establishing a high level of credibility through his past experience. I also liked how he ties his thought processes with the audience's, for example, describing how he used to rationalize the negative things he heard about renewable projects. However, it didn't change my mind about nuclear because he didn't really confront the issues that surround it head on. At the end of the day, yes, nuclear is extremely effective and efficient in producing electricity, but there's a reason it isn't popular, or there are reasons why it isn't popular. I think it would have been more convincing if Michael had discussed how nuclear has overcome or learned from past mistakes. I think the lesson for us moving forward is that we need to respect the audience and in order to tell an effective, convincing story, especially on a contentious issue like this one, you need to acknowledge the other side of an equation rather than avoid it. Thank you very much.